What is the purpose of education?
Well, I think the purpose of education is to prepare somebody for the rest of their life. So that means that they need knowledge, they need information, they need reasoning skills, a whole group of things in order to prepare them for how do they navigate as an independent adult.
Do you think that that is the general rule in education today, that's what's happening? Is it real education that's happening in the classroom?
No. I mean, the traditional model is there's a body of information and ideas that somebody needs to have in order to be an educated person. Often the goal is to prepare the person to be a good citizen. And that's often considered the goal. That's not what I consider the goal, but so the concern with whether you're developing the proper habits and skills and virtues that you need to live as an independent person is not really of concern in traditional education usually.
And why do you think that has shifted? Why have we moved from a model where becoming a whole person was the rule, or might have been the rule, to something where we're simply preparing people to be a certain kind of person or to be a certain kind of worker, for example, because I think that that's also something we see in education today. How has that shift happened? Or how have we arrived there?
Well, if you consider the way most people were educated in the United States originally, it was at home or at most in one of these one-room schoolhouses that was run by the local people, the township, their parents. They hired somebody. Very often the schools that did exist were organized for religious purposes too. There were those kinds of schools, and of course those schools did have a certain model of behavior and ethic that they were concerned about. What kind of person did they want to produce? But if we're talking about the non-sectarian schools, if your parents were educating you, they were educating you in their values, right? And their skills and how, whatever level of society they were at. In the early 19th century, there was this concern that you needed to have, there's a true concern that you need to have an educated populace in order to have a well-functioning republic. They need to be able to think, they need to be able to know some history, some ideas, recognize what's going on, know their rights, make good choices, and figure out how to elect their representatives that are actually going to protect their rights. So, I mean, that's a real concern. But the powers that be decided there were too many people coming to the United States as immigrants who were not getting educated at home. So, well, we have to start providing that. And that's when the whole public school movement came along in the early 19th century with Horace Mann, starting in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has always been a real hotbed of education because of the legacy of the Pilgrims who came over. That idea was, okay, we have to have an educated populace, and then somebody was deciding what that education should be.
We hear a lot about free market solutions in education today. Is what is termed school choice, currently vouchers, charter schools, etc., is that actually the introduction of free markets into education, or if it's not, what is it?
Well, those instruments were proposed by Milton Friedman, in the 1950s, and then Hayek in his Constitution of Liberty in 1960. Followed up with that, arguing that this was a way to at least inject some kind of competition. In other words, they had the idea, as you know, it's interesting, as economists, they don't think about the wider philosophical implications of what they propose. But they're thinking, okay, we need to have some kind of competition. We need the market is good because it provides people with a lot of options, right? So we need to try to do something to emulate a market in education. How do we do that? How do we start on dismantling the top-down control of schools as they're set up right now? So they proposed putting vouchers in place to allow parents, vouchers being money that the state would give you or the local school authority would give parents to use to buy education at a school of their choice. This offering them an opportunity to have some competition among schools. But it's not free market because the state is controlling the money. And they might start out with a good idea that, oh, okay, we're going to let parents decide, but inevitably there is going to be corruption. There's going to be somebody creating some school just so that they can accept vouchers. And then there'll be a scandal, and then the state's going to have some oversight about who's using this money, because it's not the parents' own money, right? It's money they've collected through taxes, so that they have to have some kind of fiduciary responsibility over it. And then what's going to happen? Well, then the state is going to start regulating all these private schools. Now, in Illinois, right now, we benefit from one of the freest situations for private schools of anywhere. A private school in the state of Illinois only has to be open a certain number of hours per year, follow the fire code, the health code, and be non-discriminatory. It has no oversight at all in terms of content, teaching, methodology, organization of the classroom, nothing. And this is very different than a lot of the other states. Like in New York State, all the private schools, as I understand it, all the private school teachers have to be state certified. My point being that if they start with vouchers here, only the wealthiest private schools are going to be able to resist using them. So what's going to happen? You're going to have corruption, and then the state's going to start overseeing it, and then they're going to start telling schools what they have to do. That is a terrible situation that will arise, and it's arisen in Europe. They've done stuff like that in Europe.
So vouchers cannot be considered free market. A lot of people also think that charter schools are a way to inject free market. Can you talk a little bit about whether charter schools can be free marketed or not?
Well, look, you have this problem of these kids warehoused in these terrible schools, just ruining their lives. And I'm really concerned about what to do about that. But a charter school is even farther from free market than a voucher is. Because a voucher, at least a parent is deciding where he's going to buy his education, right? He's going to buy his education on some kind of market. A charter school is dependent on getting approval from some government body to be allowed to open, and getting special money from the government body in order to function. And that's just like a recipe for cronyism. I mean, come on. What it is it's more options for the kids.
Right.
And sometimes the charter schools are good, and sometimes they're better than a lot better.
Right, or at least initially, right?
Yeah.
Initially.
Yeah.
But what you're telling me is if the money follows the child, ultimately the regulations also follow the child.
Exactly.
And so when you do that, over time, how do you do anything but homogenize education?
And have some bureaucrats deciding what the curriculum is going to be, what the methodology is going to be, what the ideas are going to be,
what data you have to give up, all of it. Yep. Is government the only way to make education accessible to all then? So we have this problem, right, where we want to ensure that all children have access. I mean, you and I are both people who would advocate all children, having a good education, but is government the only way to ensure that? I mean, how do you can't mandate it and have it be free market, but can you create a situation, an environment, a society in which education is accessible to all children and can be the kind of education that child and that child's parents would choose? I mean, this is something you've talked about, somewhat in your essay in Common Ground on Common Core, but I'd be, fascinated to hear your thoughts responding to that problem.
Let me ask you something. Do all children in the United States pretty much have food and clothes?
Yes.
Is the government responsible for that?
Well, that's an interesting question because, I don't think government should be responsible for that. Government, in some senses, has been responsible for that.
Before it was, were there children running around naked?
Not a lot.
I'm not talking about other countries where there's a different form of government.
Right.
Were there children starving in the United States before that?
I think very few.
Very few. So how did that happen?
Likely it was happening through families, that people were being taken care of through families, that people were being taken care of through the church, that people were being taken care of through private charity.
You're talking about people who can't take care of themselves.
Who can't take care of themselves.
Okay, for the most part, it was taken care of by people themselves.
Who took care of it. Yes,
right.
Correct.
They
right.
earned their own money, and on the market they bought clothes, and the market provided clothes and food.
Right.
I don't see why that's going to be any different when it comes to education. The market won't provide education. For those who have difficulty paying for it, education is one of the most valued things in the United States of anything. I have no doubt that millions and billions of dollars would be donated to help children who couldn't afford it themselves. I have no doubt about that. They set up, say, something like the Donors Trust, where you could give money to a Donors Trust for scholarships, and then that organization administered scholarships for worthy families. We also know that there's all different kinds of schools that could be created for all different kinds of needs, because not everybody needs the same kind of education. Of course, most people should learn how to read and write, the absolute basics, and probably they should learn some history, some basic ideas, knowledge that almost any school could provide. Then after that, what they need to learn in many respects is up to them and their parents, right? What they consider, what they judge to be what they need to know for the rest of their life, or to prepare them for adult life. I think you would have a thriving market for that. I mean, it would just like there's a million different kinds of phones that you can buy, or there's all different kinds of shoes. I'm trying to think of something that would be like an equivalent service of a more complicated product. Buying video games. That's a very complicated product. And yet, there's all different kinds that you can buy, right? Depending on what your interest is. It could be Candy Crush or it could be Bioshock.
Do we currently have a stratified system of education? And do we have a class-based system?
In some respects, I guess you'd call it that, because it's partly based on where you live and what your income is. And of course, there's some areas that are more self-perpetuating than others, both in poverty and in wealth. But on the other hand, I mean, all the economic data is the United States is still like this roiling, constantly changing society where people shoot up and they make $1 million and their family loses everything and they're down in the bottom again. And the guy who has nothing makes money, and the technology changes and the businesses that are on top change. So there are issues of class, and certainly right now, for example, the kids who are raised in upper middle class families, they're given a lot of knowledge, they're given a lot of background. For example, there was a study out of Kansas State, that found that children from upper middle class families, I think middle class too, heard 30 million more words by the time they were out of childhood than lower class families. 30 million. Now, I mean, I don't remember exactly how they're counting them all. Does it include every A and the? But it's not really relevant. I mean, in the sense that number is so gigantic that it really shows something. You know, now, no state is pushing that, right? It's that some families are more educated and more thoughtful and more ambitious, and they're talking a lot to their children. So, is that a class thing, or what is it exactly?
Is it an opportunity thing? Just because, for example, you do have communities that have been vastly destabilized.
Mm-hmm.
The family has been undermined.
Yes.
The economic base has been undermined. You have a system of dependence.
Yes.
That has really taken root. You have perhaps large quantities of populations in those areas where there may be drug addiction or alcoholism or...
That's all created by the state. That's not created by a free market. There is a group of people, for example, who the parents are highly educated and they pass on a lot of knowledge, networking, and all that to their children, and those children are socially much more privileged than other people, than people who say come from a working class background but are brilliant and make their way up the academic ladder into a top university, for example. The upper middle class children with an academic background are going to have a lot of knowledge that the other people don't. But so what you do see is you do see a lot of networking and development of businesses and advantages with people like that.
Sure.
But it's not set in stone either.
Right.
I mean, you still have people who are just outliers and mavericks and coming from nowhere.
Right. It is interesting to me to think about that discrepancy in vocabulary. It's a stunning number.
Stunning.
It really is stunning.
Yeah.
But when you think about that, and you think about some of these destabilized communities that I was talking about earlier, and some of them are, sometimes it's very much tied to minority status. You have large swaths of Black communities or Latino communities or whatever where this has started to. I think the family has actually survived better in Latino communities than it has in the Black community, but. When you think about what's happened in those communities, and I think you're right that this is largely created by the state. I mean, it's policy that has created these situations. But the children that are in those communities end up being the victims of those policies.
Yes.
And then we keep piling more bad policy on top of more bad policy and more bad policy, and how it does in a way. Become difficult for a child who's in a destabilized community like that to crawl out of it. It's
terribly difficult.
It's not that it's impossible, but man, it's difficult.
No, they need help. They need a lot of help from other people.
Yeah. How do governments and corporations foster a situation in which education actually becomes almost a stumbling block for people in some of these destabilized communities? And what kinds of policies might help reverse some of the destabilization that's happened? And let me preface the whole question by saying I don't think it's impossible that what's happened in these destabilized communities becomes far more widespread. In fact, I think it is spreading. I think as these policies continue to deepen and expand, we are seeing problems more widespread.
Well, you have a lot of spread of problems in education in the last 30 years because the federal government has decided to get involved in local schooling. They've been kind of like a Pied Piper. They've said, oh, if you do this, we'll give you this money. If you do that, we'll give you this money. And the schools are saying, free money. Okay, we'll do it, Who in those schools has an interest to maintain their integrity as an educational institution? I'm not sure. The parents aren't in control. Who's watching the watchers in that respect, So the feds came in. We had about 30 years of educational policies in which they were trying to implement kind of Deweyan, progressive, we can't be as restrictive, we're not going to be as regimented, we want to be more sensitive to the individual person, we're not going to have as many requirements that everybody's supposed to follow. And that turned out to be a disaster because then nobody was learning anything. They had no criteria by which they were deciding what needed to be learned. So then you had the conservatives come in and say, well, we have to do something about this. We have to have standards. And they instituted these programs, and No Child Left Behind and other programs, that in my mind are basically Soviet-style top-down programs. They said, from the top, from the federal government, we're going to say everybody has to follow this standard. Everybody has to be at this level of arithmetic by the time they're 9 years old. And we're going to check this with these standardized tests. So then you had 20 years of No Child Left Behind, which has been a gigantic disaster, because what happens? Everybody teaches to the test because the money is tied to the test. And now that's been an obvious problem, so they're instituting this new thing, Common Core, where, they've revamped everything, and they're going to make sure everybody knows how to do critical thinking, and, well, that's baloney, because they're still measuring it with a standardized test. You can't do that. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. You've got these corporations who are having difficulty finding employees that are capable. And so they get worried and they think, okay, what we have to do is organize everything and make sure that public education is better so that we can at least get some decent employees, And they come in with their programs. And I'm sure in many cases it's not for insidious reasons. It's because they think, okay, they're going to change things and they're going to make the education better, and then people are going to learn their science and their math and their reading and writing, and then they'll be able to be better employees. When you do all this through this centralized process, you do not serve the individual needs of education, and you end up having all these corporations in bed with government bureaucrats directing who's going to be taught what, when, and where.
How is language being used to fool people in the realm of economics and education? What kinds of games do you see being played with language? How have those games been used to either push certain kinds of policies through or manipulate people into believing that we need certain kinds of policies? What are some of the games you see being played with language?
Well, the number one I've seen is this idea of standards, that we have to have standards. And it's not that I don't think, if by standards you mean that you want a child in general to be able to do X, Y, and Z by the time they graduate from school. Of course you do. You want that person to be able to navigate their life. And to do that, they need to read, they need to do some math, they need to understand some history, some civics. Of course. But the idea that there's like one standard that everybody should follow is baloney, because people are different. We don't have one standard that we use for everything that we eat. We don't have one standard that we use for everything that we wear, for every toothbrush. Why would we want it for something as complicated as education? So I think that's a critical idea. If you think about it, the way the Soviets used to run things, that, okay, we have to have a car, so the car has got to have X, Y, and Z, and they produced one kind of car. And that's what they're trying to do with education. Mm-hmm. It's that idea of standardization. Mm-hmm. That it's a mass process. Mm-hmm. It's not a mass process. We're a society of individuals, and individuals flourish differently. You, on the one hand, want to be objective about what people need in the long run to live well, but on the other hand, you want to also be aware that people differ a lot, and so they're going to need different kinds of input, different kinds of education.
Do you think that common ground on education exists across the political spectrum? And if so, where is it?
I think it can, and it depends on who really cares about individual children. Who cares about the lives of individual children? And if they do, then we can find common ground to revolt against the powers that be that are trying to control everybody.
What is an essay, other than your own, in Common Ground on Common Core that you think everyone should read?
For decades, we've been reading how poorly the students in the United States are doing in science and math compared to the rest of the world. And I was just amazed at, but of course, it had kind of a of course I should have known this moment about the...
Is it Chris Tinkin?
Yes, that one. Yes. Challenging core assumptions. Why does U.S. performance on international assessments really tell us? Where he showed how, of course, the rest of the countries are cherry picking who they're including. And that's not to say that the kids here are doing that well in science and math on the average, but our best are doing as well or better as the best anywhere else. And once I read that, I'm like, of course, that would be the case. Same thing happens with the statistics on infant mortality. Did you know that? We report everything. Other countries don't. So that's why some place like Cuba can look like they're in better shape than we are.
What is the outlook for local control in our education system? Let me put it this way. On the current trajectory that we are on, is local control, can it survive? Does it even really still exist?
I don't think so. No. Not much of it. There's too much oversight from the state and from the federal government. The only thing I can see happening, though, is, and it's very common with, if you look at the history of America, I think it might have been de Tocqueville said something like, Americans are so busy with their private lives that they don't pay attention to what's going on until it's a crisis. And then they say, uh-oh, we don't want that. And then they just change everything. And I can kind of foresee that kind of thing happening, that there could be a watershed situation where people just totally revolt against it gets so bad. The public education situation gets so bad, people just totally revolt against it. I mean, I've wondered about the case with the Affordable Care Act, whether that's going to push people. They're going to be so unhappy with it. It's so expensive. It's so unresponsive to individual needs, whether that's going to push people into a cash market. And that will just break the whole crazy healthcare system that we have right now that's been caused by the federal government, the government's being involved.
You have a Montessori school.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have had some discussions in the past about the differences between Dewey and Montessori, and as a matter of fact, that's one of the ways that I knew I needed to reach out to you to do an essay in the book, is
Mm-hmm.
that you had done this review of somebody else's book about Dewey and Montessori.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious to hear you articulate what kinds of differences you see between Dewey and Montessori. And I'm really particularly fascinated by your viewpoint because you don't throw Dewey out entirely. You see certain value in Dewey, but you just don't agree with his underlying philosophy, his ideology, I guess one could say. So if you could just talk a little bit about Dewey and Montessori and
Sure.
the differences between them and what the value is in each of them and where you think the stumbling points are.
Dewey actually was the person who brought Montessori over to the United States initially in, I think, 1912. He knew a lot about education. He knew a lot about how to teach. Where he fundamentally disagrees with Montessori and with me is that his aim is to prepare somebody to be socialized, to be assimilated into the group. His concern was how is the group functioning. He's at core very collectivistic, and you can see that in his pedagogic creed. All you have to do is ever look that up. Montessori at core is an individualist. She thinks that the purpose of education is to help each individual child flourish, whoever they may be, and the entire system of the Montessori method is aimed at the child following his own path of education. Because she said, and I think this is obviously true, human beings are too complicated for anyone to know what's going on inside them. It's almost, the analogy is, if you're going to grow sunflowers, okay, you've got 10 seeds. You don't know what the potential of each one of those seeds is. It's a mystery. It's too complicated. The best thing you can do is to give those seeds the highest quality environment that you can. The best soil, the best water, the best sunlight, the best fertilizer, so that they can actualize their maximum potential. The same thing is true of human beings, and that's what you try to do in a Montessori environment. Montessori was very much aimed at how to allow the individual person to flourish, find out what they're most interested in, what they're best at, what they want to do with their life. And by doing that, the students learn how to get along with each other and have a very peaceful community. She had an ultimate aim, which was world peace, but the way she wanted to do it was by helping each individual flourish.
Jeff Horn, in his essay in the book, talks about Dewey to some extent, but talks about him in relationship to what ultimately has been nicknamed Taylorism, and talks about how Dewey, in a sense, lost that war. Dewey would not have, I think, agreed with much of what he sees going on in education today, even though you and I might not agree with Dewey. Dewey would not have agreed with what's going on today either. Mm-hmm. We've had discussions, too, about comparisons of prisons and schools today. There's an architectural similarity, there's an organizational structural similarity, there's a mechanistic similarity, things like bells and shifting people around from place to place at prearranged times, etc. If we started to move away from standardization, if we started to move away from the factory model of education, this standardized, centralized factory model of education, you've talked about the ways that, people would just be blown out of the water by the kinds of changes that they would see, the kinds of variety they would see in schools, including in architecture and what those schools catered to and where the kinds of places they were located and all of that. How do we start to break this idea that this is what a school looks like, this is how a school functions? How do we start to spark people's imaginations about what education could look like, what schools could look like? Because it seems to me that people's imaginations about this have been really almost purposefully stunted.
Before I get on to that, I want to say one more thing about Dewey and Montessori.
Sure.
I think Dewey comes from a much more strictly Rousseauian point of view about education, which, if you read Emile, which is Rousseau's book on education, he does not think that the intellect should be developed early on. He thinks the child should be allowed to live like wild and free, almost naked, and have no intellectual development till they're like 8 or 9 years old. Montessori is like the opposite of that. She recognized that the child is desperately trying to develop their intellect from the time they're born, and that if you give them the proper environment, they're just going to soar straight ahead with their intellectual development. And this will not interfere, unlike many people's fear that it suppresses the imagination. It doesn't. The imagination has to have some content. I think what happens is they think about school as, oh, you're sitting down doing your ABCs and it's like boring you to death and it's beating the life out of your creativity. But that's not what goes on in a Montessori school. Instead, it's very active, it's very interesting, it's very exciting. Children work with each other. So you have a tremendous development of the intellect along with creativity. As far as your question about what would schools look like, think about all the different grocery stores we have and how beautiful some of them are, right? And since the introduction of Whole Foods, how the Jewel and the local grocery stores all of a sudden are providing international foods and fresh fish,
organics,
and gelato and coffee in the store and all this kind of thing. We see this kind of variety and beauty and aesthetic beauty in products all the time. And especially the freer the market is, you'll notice you get the most variety. So what's one of the freest markets in the United States? Electronics. It is amazing what you can get in electronics, right? It seems like groceries are too, because we've just got all kinds of different kinds of grocery stores. Or how about spas? Spas are entirely free market. Think about what people get in terms of their environment in a spa. Beautiful walls, natural pathways you can walk on. You could do that in a school. In fact, a lot of Montessori schools are architecturally specially designed to bring nature in from the outside, kind of in a Frank Lloyd Wright ideology of architecture. When the child's growing up, it's very important for them to be in touch with nature. They learn a tremendous amount, and it's also very calming. It allows for a lot of meditation to be in nature.
How do we break through the subconscious in a way, the collective subconscious of the American people at this point, because they've been trained to envision schools in a certain way. How do you begin to break through that and get the American people to reimagine?
Well, it seems to me you have to start by finding a way to actually create a real market to help free up the market in education. Of course, I'd have to know the legal ramifications, but I wonder whether something like tax credits would be a better way to go, because that's where you're directly controlling the money. Now, it might be the case that legally it would be considered the same thing, and you'd end up with the same kind of oversight, so I don't know. But somebody needs to think about, how do we start providing a circumstance where you can actually have more examples of schools.
You run something called Recent Individualism Freedom Institute. And as part of that, you run a summer program called the Great Connections Seminar. It lasts a few weeks every summer, is that?
Well, so far, we've only done it for 1 week. We've done it for 6 years. It's had very consistent results, so we're trying to expand it now. This year we're going for double enrollment, and eventually what we want to do is to expand it to more and more weeks and make it into a permanent institution. The idea of it is to provide not only teaching in really important knowledge and ideas across the liberal arts, so from poetry to physics, but use a methodology that highly nurtures independent thinking. So we use a special discussion methodology in our classrooms. We usually use selections from the classics because they tend to be the best that has been thought and said. And they tend to be the works that have had so much impact on our current civilization that if you understand them, you can understand where we are right now. The combination of those two highly shores up the students' ability to think for themselves. We use a very specialized methodology. It's evidence and reason-based discussion in a methodology called shared inquiry. We also want to bring in the real world. We want to make sure that whatever ideas we're studying in the classroom, we ask ourselves, well, what if we lived by these ideas, what would their impact be in the real world? So we try to do activities that connect up what's going on in everyday life with what we're studying in the classroom. So for example, we have a small talk about the history of Chicago and why it's the center of architecture. And then we have some study of architectural styles. We talk about building, what is the difference between architecture and building. And then we actually go out in the city and we tour around and look at the different buildings, look at the layout of the streets, learn about the history of why things are the way they are in the city of Chicago, to get them thinking about, not just accepting whatever's here as the given. Because that's the problem, is that whatever you grow up with, you tend to accept as the given, and you don't learn to ask yourself, how did this happen? Because how it happened is really important. Especially if it's a good thing, you want to make sure it happens in the future. Another thing that we do is we bring in very accomplished professionals from all different kinds of backgrounds to talk to the students. So we've had opera singers, we've had financiers, we've had physicists, factory owners, ballet dancers, entrepreneurs. They come in and they talk to the students about their life, how they chose what they did, how they navigated their life, why they enjoyed what they did, how they kept true to their values. And the students find this very eye-opening because, just like I said, you tend to just accept whatever you grew up with as the given. Well, most people only know whatever they grew up with in their family, like whatever profession or background they came from in their family. They don't have a wide knowledge of what's possible out there. This is an opportunity for them to meet people from all different walks of life and get a little taste of, well, what's possible, And especially our aim is to prepare the students to live well as autonomous and free human beings. And so this way it gives them an opportunity to find out, well, how did other people stick true to their values while they navigated their careers?
This is for primarily high school and college age students,
right,
that you do this.
Right. 16. Well, our official age is 16 to 24, but we kind of bend it on on the long side. I don't want to go any younger because of the social difficulty, but on the other side, sometimes we'll include older students too. So what happens in our program as a consequence of the ideas, the methodology, we urge the students to make the connections between everything that we're studying, is this spontaneous creation of a kind of mini society of free individuals. The students that come out of our program over and over have said to me that they feel transformed, they've had their independence tremendously shored up, and they feel like they've lived 1 week in a free society. So it's a way for them to develop the habits and the values that you need to then go out and spread that in the rest of the society. So this is something that I consider one of our competitive advantages over other wonderful, there's many, many wonderful seminars in the summer that are teaching the ideas of a free society, but the particular methodology and society that we create in the seminar because of our methodology and our approach gives the students a different kind of experience.
Why would a parent want to send their child to the Great Connections seminar? And you've said so many amazing, interesting things about it, but specifically if you're a parent, what would be motivating to a parent?
They will come home transformed. I've had multiple parents tell me that they came home changed. From the first year that we ran it, one mother said her 16-year-old came home as a man, whereas he had gone as a boy. Another mother a few years ago said her daughter, 17-year-old daughter, very, very bright, but extremely shy, so shy that when she wanted to communicate with her mother, she would email her. Came home from the seminar, immediately went out and got her driver's license and started tutoring adults at the local community college.
So it sounds to me like this is something that not only frees the individual to be the person that they truly want to be, but enables them to do that in a way that engenders true critical thinking, true examination of the society, true analysis of where their skills and abilities could actually have an impact within their society. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
It shocked me that this could happen after 1 week. I mean, my aim is to establish a full-time institution. So if you could get this after 1 week, what would happen if you had a full-time institution? One of the proofs about how powerful the program is to me is I now have quite a few of the students actually working to help me with the program.
You've expanded this internationally already. So you're doing it here in Chicago, but you also have a program in Buenos Aires.
I don't know how many people in the audience here are aware of the tremendous problems they've had in Argentina in the last 40, 50 years due to the populist and fascist governments that they've had that have been taking away more and more of their freedoms. But there's quite a active group down there pushing for free society reforms. We actually ran one of these already, but we're supposed to do more this year. They want to run weekend seminars for businessmen, business people, to learn a lot of these ideas that, well, as the head of the organization puts it, makes North America so successful compared to the rest of the world. So we're going to use this methodology that we're using in the Great Connections in the summer. We'll be studying classics, and we're going to be organizing the business people to come up with projects to do that will help to reform their culture and their government.